Sometimes, the most incredible secrets hide in the unlikeliest corners of everyday life. In a bustling courtroom in downtown Chicago, a mild-mannered, bright-eyed young black girl captures everyone's attention, though not in the way she deserves. Cops sneer at her, attorneys roll their eyes, and the judge barely spares her a second glance. They see her as an easy target, a vulnerable soul with no power. Little do they know, the entire scene has been orchestrated to reveal something extraordinary. Because this quiet, unassuming figure is no ordinary citizen. She's a brilliant U.S. attorney in disguise, ready to shake the entire system to its core. Rain had been pouring relentlessly since dawn, battering the tall windows of the Edward J. Schwartz Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago and turning the streets into glossy ribbons of reflection. Outside, cars crawled through traffic, headlights slicing through the thick curtain of raindrops. Inside the courthouse, the echo of footsteps on polished floors mingled with hushed conversations as people carried their anxieties and hopes into the venerable halls of justice. Amid the usual swirl of lawyers, defendants, and clerks, a petite black girl stood near the metal detectors, holding a worn-out umbrella. She was slender, with wide, observant brown eyes that flickered across the lobby as though she were searching for a friend or an ally in this unfamiliar space. The courthouse staff barely glanced at her. She was just another face in the daily crowd. Yet, the set of her shoulders and the way she quietly observed everything hinted at a deeper confidence, like someone calmly treading water in a raging sea. This was Amara Davis. At first glance, she looked like a recent high school grad, maybe a quiet college freshman. She wore a simple navy blue blazer that had seen better days, her hair neatly braided back from her face. There was no flamboyance, no bold print, nothing that demanded attention. But a certain fire in her eyes contradicted her unassuming attire. She stepped forward, letting security check her bag. The guard found nothing out of the ordinary: a small notebook, a tattered copy of the Constitution, and a single pen. With a curt nod, he waved her through. Within moments, she became nearly invisible in the sea of people moving through the corridors. Lawyers in crisp suits rushed past with determined strides, flipping through their legal documents. Plaintiffs sat anxiously waiting for their turn, while defendants glanced around nervously. No one took special notice of Amara. That was just how she wanted it because, despite her youthful appearance, she was no ordinary observer. She was here for a case that would define her career. She was here to catch the bad guys in the act, bad guys who would never see her coming. Courtroom 12B had a reputation for high-stakes drama. It was neither the largest nor the most ornate chamber in the building, but it had seen some of Chicago's most talked-about cases in the past decade. Rumor had it that the intense hush that hung in the air was haunted by the ghosts of verdicts long since passed. Today promised to be no different. Amara slipped in quietly, taking a seat at the far edge of the public gallery. She kept her head bowed, watching as the judge's clerk organized a stack of files at the front. The guard by the door paid her no mind, focusing instead on the attorneys who were milling around, exchanging last-minute notes. At the other side of the aisle, a pair of uniformed officers eyed the crowd, their expressions bordering on smug. Detective Alan Monroe and Officer Jeremy Pierce were seasoned cops with a string of misconduct allegations lodged against them. Whispers in the hallway claimed they always found a way out of trouble, someone was always covering for them, or some evidence magically vanished at the right time. Yet, over the years, more and more complaints from the black community in certain neighborhoods had piled up, raising alarm bells among civil rights organizations. Today, Monroe and Pierce were set to testify in a case about police brutality. They had arrested a man named Tyrone Bipps, claiming he was in possession of illegal substances. Tyrone insisted the cops had planted the drugs on him, roughed him up, and taunted him with racial slurs. Though allegations of police misconduct were often dismissed for lack of evidence, this time Tyrone had managed to find a lawyer willing to push back. Amara watched from a distance as the two officers swaggered up to the front, wearing that typical air of complacence. Monroe had a thick build and a mustache that twitched whenever he was asked a difficult question. Pierce, leaner with sharp, cold eyes, rarely said much in public. Yet, the two of them seemed relaxed, as if they already knew the outcome. For them, this was just another day of going through the motions. Quietly, Amara pulled out her notebook and started scribbling. She took note of the judge, an older man with silver hair and an even-keeled manner. She noted the mood of the small audience, the presence of the court reporter, and every detail of the two cops' demeanors. In her mind, she was already constructing a complex puzzle, and each observation was a piece that might fit somewhere, shaping the final picture. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor and defense attorney made their opening statements. The defense, representing Tyrone, laid out the alleged misconduct: unlawful search, racial slurs, excessive force, and false evidence. The prosecutor, representing the state, parried with the officer's side of the story, alleging Tyrone had been caught red-handed with enough drugs to indicate intent to distribute. Throughout these statements, Monroe and Pierce sat with the lazy confidence of men who had done this 100 times before. A slight smirk crossed Monroe's lips when Tyrone's defense attorney spoke passionately about the need to fight systemic injustice. Pierce yawned behind his hand at one point. Meanwhile, Amara, perched quietly in the back row, studied them. She could sense their dismissive attitude. It made her stomach churn to see how casually they seemed to treat the idea of justice. But crucially, she kept her face impassive, feigning disinterest so as not to draw attention. When the judge called for the first recess, a whisper of movement swept through the room. People stood up, stretched, and filed out into the hallway. Amara lingered, waiting for her moment, carefully watching Monroe and Pierce as they chatted with some colleagues. Their laughter echoed in the corridor. She noticed a subtle exchange of glances between the two men, as if they were sharing an inside joke. Moments later, as she made her way toward a small vending machine area, she overheard snatches of conversation. Monroe's voice was low and brimming with scorn. "That girl in the back, she's been staring at us," he grunted. Pierce shrugged. "Probably just one of those local activists or something. They always show up, think they know the law better than we do." They both chuckled. There was a derisive tone to their laughter, one that made Amara's jaw tighten. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself to stay calm. She wasn't supposed to blow her cover yet. She was here to gather evidence, to observe how these men operated in the courtroom. Even so, the sting of their mockery lingered. It fueled her resolve, reaffirming precisely why she was there. They saw her as powerless, a nobody. Soon, they would realize just how wrong they were. The day wore on. Witnesses were called. Questions flew back and forth like the well-choreographed dance it often was. The justice system creaked along. Each side tried to frame the narrative. Tyrone's side insisted on a pattern of racist policing, while the state alleged a blatant disregard for the law by an unknown troublemaker. While in recess, the courthouse hallways became a stage for hushed conversations. Amara intentionally wandered close to Monroe and Pierce, always keeping a small crowd or a pillar between them so they wouldn't notice her. She listened as they recounted their version of events to another uniformed officer. They spoke about Tyrone as if he were subhuman. They threw around casual remarks about his race, about neighborhoods they deemed crime-ridden. At one point, Pierce eyed her across the hallway again. This time, Amara let her gaze drop to the floor, feigning the air of a timid onlooker. He snorted, shaking his head, and turned back to his conversation. "Kids these days," he muttered, "always meddling where they don't belong." She could tell they believed wholeheartedly in their own superiority. They believed the system was on their side, that any challenges would fall flat. And for a long time, they had been right. No real accountability had ever come their way. But Amara had done her homework. She had pored over internal affairs documents, external watchdog reports, and dozens of testimonies from victims who said they'd been brutalized or framed by these officers. She knew the story went much deeper than a single arrest or one questionable incident. She was convinced these two were part of a larger network that protected abusive cops in Chicago's 9th Precinct. As the day's session drew to a close, the judge announced that the trial would resume the following morning with more witness testimony. People shuffled out, and Monroe and Pierce swaggered to the exit. Before they left, Pierce cast one last glance at Amara, his expression a mix of mockery and mild curiosity. She didn't react, she simply watched them go. Once the courtroom was empty, she slipped away through the side door, heading for the bus stop in the drizzling rain, a silent determination guiding every step. Amara's small studio apartment wasn't much, just a cramped space with a modest kitchenette and a fold-out bed located on the south side. It offered her anonymity. She'd moved there deliberately a month ago to embed herself in the neighborhood and understand the local sentiment about policing. That evening, she spread out her files on a rickety desk under a single overhead lamp. Photographs, typed notes, scribbled lists of dates, All of it formed a patchwork map of corruption. In the center were the faces of officers Alan Monroe and Jeremy Pierce. Surrounding them were lines connecting them to other names in the precinct, other possible cases of misconduct, and a few references to potential backdoor deals with local gangs. In another binder, she had her official documents, the letter from the U.S. Department of Justice assigning her to a special undercover operation. Her real identity was that of a highly regarded assistant U.S. attorney, known within the department for her meticulous approach and relentless pursuit of justice. She was an alumnus of Harvard Law School. She had the diploma with all its gravitas tucked away in her real apartment across town. She had devised this undercover role, posing as a naive young observer, to gather first-hand evidence of the arrogant attitudes and potential wrongdoing that were often lost in formal transcripts. She knew that corrupt officers frequently let their guard down when they believed no one important was watching. Sprawled before her was a labyrinth of wrongdoing. She discovered systematic cover-ups involving falsified police reports, tampered body cam footage, and intimidation of witnesses. Monroe and Pierce's case wasn't just about two rogue cops. It was a symptom of a diseased system. To root it out, she needed undeniable evidence, solid proof that would hold up in court and break through the blue wall of silence. She stayed up until the early hours, reviewing every document, cross-referencing every testimony. Each new piece of evidence felt like a stone in a growing avalanche. But to set that avalanche off, she needed to ensure the right moment to reveal her true identity. When she finally fell asleep, face pressed against a half-finished paragraph in her notebook, she dreamt of a courthouse shaking under the weight of the truth. Bright and early the next day, the Chicago sun gleamed off puddles on the courthouse steps, as if attempting to wipe away the gloom of the prior day's rain. Amara navigated the bustling morning crowd, her posture hunched beneath a lightweight jacket. She was careful to keep her face as plain and unassuming as possible. She carried the same worn-out notebook and pen. Inside, the corridors buzzed with renewed energy. Lawyers conferred with clients in quick, tense whispers. Courtroom clerks scurried with stacks of case files. And at the far end of the hallway, Amara spotted Monroe and Pierce leaning against a wall, sipping coffee from paper cups, looking as if they owned the place. Today's proceedings were critical. More witness testimonies had been scheduled, including potential eyewitnesses to Tyrone's arrest. Amara knew, however, that these testimonies would be heavily scrutinized, especially if any witness had a past record or a personal stake in the matter. The reality of the justice system was that the credibility of witnesses from marginalized communities was often questioned far more aggressively than that of police officers. Amara slipped into courtroom 12B once again and found a seat behind Tyrone's defense attorney, a dogged middle-aged man named Marcus Lattimore. She recognized his name from her research. Lattimore was known for taking on tough cases against the Chicago Police Department, though he rarely won. Nonetheless, he was tenacious. The morning session began with Lattimore calling a neighbor who claimed to have seen the arrest from her apartment window. The witness, an elderly black woman, clutched her purse nervously and recounted how the officers had pulled Tyrone from his car, thrown him to the ground, and appeared to search him without probable cause. She said she never saw them take any baggies of drugs from his pockets until much later, after additional officers arrived. The prosecutor went into immediate attack mode, questioning the woman's eyesight, questioning the time of day, her vantage point, her personal biases. Every aspect of her story was dissected to sow doubt. Meanwhile, Monroe sat with a smug grin, occasionally locking eyes with the prosecutor as if to say, "Nice job." Amara documented every reaction, every scoff, every smirk. She could see the weight of systemic cynicism pressing down on the defense's case. Even so, she knew the real bombshell was yet to come. Once she confronted them with her hidden arsenal of evidence, their bravado would collapse. But not just yet. At midday recess, Amara left the courtroom and headed to the water fountain in the hallway. As she leaned down to drink, she felt the presence of someone behind her. A shadow fell across her shoulder. Straightening up, she turned to find Detective Alan Monroe standing a couple of steps away, arms folded. His eyes flicked down at her with poorly disguised contempt. "You've been hanging around a lot," he said in a low, gruff voice. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Amara feigned confusion. "I'm just interested in the case. I study legal proceedings in my free time, that's all." Her tone was deliberately timid, as though she were afraid of his authority. Monroe's mouth twisted into a half-smile. You think you're some kind of law student? He asked, his tone mocking. She shook her head. Not exactly. I just like to learn, and I was curious. Pierce strolled up then, sipping a soda. He glanced down at Amara, looked at Monroe, and then shrugged. She's harmless, man. Let's go. We got better things to do. But Monroe held his ground. Listen, sweetie, he said, leaning closer so only she could hear him. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not going to change anything. We know the system. We run this system. So do yourself a favor. Go home. Find a better hobby. Amara's heart hammered in her chest, not out of fear, but out of the sheer anger at his arrogance. She forced herself to blink and look down. I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to upset anyone. Monroe stared at her for another moment, seemingly expecting a different reaction. When she remained still, he chuckled, turned on his heel, and walked away with Pierce. As they disappeared around the corner, Amara's expression hardened. If he wanted a war, she was more than willing to give him one. Only he had no idea just how powerful her arsenal truly was. Returning to her seat, Amara replayed the confrontation in her mind. She needed to keep her composure, needed to remember her training. Let them underestimate me, she thought. Let them mock me. After the lunch break, a few more witnesses were called, some supporting Tyrone's claim, others bolstering the police narrative. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable. During a brief pause, Marcus Lattimore, Tyrone's lawyer, turned around to grab some documents from his table. He glanced at Amara. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, barely noticeable to anyone else, but enough for him to register that he had at least one person in the gallery rooting for him. Lattimore returned a subtle nod of acknowledgement. When the session ended for the day and the crowd began to disperse, Amara quietly approached Lattimore near the defense bench. He was stuffing files into his worn briefcase. Mr. Lattimore, she said softly, her voice still carrying that uncertain, gentle lilt. He looked up, eyes tired but curious. Yes, I've been following this case, she began. I'm just a law enthusiast, but I think you're doing good work here. A weary smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Thanks. It's an uphill battle, but I appreciate the support. She hesitated, then continued. I've come across some information about those officers. If I had some documents that might help prove a pattern of misconduct, how would I get them to you? His eyes sharpened. If you have legitimate evidence, you can bring it directly to my office. But be careful. You don't want it to disappear. Amara nodded, pressing her lips together. Yes, sir. I understand. She gave him a slip of paper she'd prepared in advance with a contact number that led to her secure line. Lattimore studied it, then tucked it into his breast pocket. Thank you, he said sincerely. We need all the help we can get. Amara offered a small, polite smile before turning away. She wouldn't reveal who she truly was just yet, but every step she took now was one step closer to unveiling the monstrous abuse of power and ensuring that justice would finally strike back. That evening, back in her studio, Amara carefully prepared a dossier of preliminary evidence, anonymized for now, just enough to pique Lattimore's interest and support his argument in court without revealing the entire scope of her undercover operation. She had to tread a fine line. Revealing too little wouldn't make an impact, but revealing too much could compromise the broader sting she was planning. She laid out key documents. Internal affairs complaints never properly investigated, witness statements from other victims who had stories disturbingly similar to Tyrone's. She included snippets of the body cam logs that were conveniently missing from official files, logs she'd managed to recover through a contact in the Department of Justice's digital forensics team. The next morning, she waited for Lattimore at a small cafe across the street from the courthouse. When he arrived, his shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, and the lines beneath his eyes were deeper than ever. She handed him a plain envelope. Take a look at this when you can, she said softly, still maintaining her persona of a concerned law enthusiast. It might help. He frowned, carefully examining the outside of the envelope. How did you get this? Amara met his eyes, carefully gauging how much to disclose. I have sources. Let's just say I'm not the only one who wants to see justice served. Lattimore nodded slowly. I'll review it. And if it's real, it could change everything. She studied his reaction, noting the spark of renewed hope behind his fatigue. Just use it carefully, she cautioned. I don't want it to vanish. He gave her a solemn nod. I understand. I've been in this game long enough to know how evidence can evaporate if it ends up in the wrong hands. With that, they parted ways. Amara felt a flicker of triumph in her chest. The stage was set for a confrontation that would catch Monroe and Pierce off guard. Still, she had to keep herself in check. Patience was crucial. The best chance for justice would come when the trap was fully laid and the evidence was irrefutable. For all their swagger, Monroe and Pierce were in for a rude awakening. The next day in court, Lattimore moved to introduce new evidence. He spoke of having discovered additional records that might establish a pattern of conduct by officers Monroe and Pierce. Immediately, the prosecutor objected, citing chain of custody issues and demanding to know the source. The judge, however, seemed intrigued. He allowed a brief recess to let both sides review these new documents. A ripple of tension coursed through the courtroom. Monroe and Pierce exchanged glances that looked like thinly veiled panic. Amara, seated off to the side, caught the subtle shift in their demeanor, a tensing of the shoulders, a flicker of unease in their eyes. During the recess, she watched as the prosecutor confronted Lattimore in the hallway. Their exchange was heated. Though she couldn't catch every word, she sensed that the prosecutor was demanding to see the original source, wanting to discredit it. Lattimore, to his credit, refused to disclose more than necessary, citing the protection of sources in cases of police corruption. Monroe and Pierce hovered a few steps away, heads bowed in urgent conversation. They occasionally cast suspicious glances in Amara's direction. She pretended not to notice, focusing instead on her notebook, scribbling lines that meant nothing at all. But internally, she was bracing for a confrontation. She had expected them to grow suspicious once new evidence began surfacing. When court resumed, the judge announced he would review the documents in his chambers before deciding whether they could be admitted. Lattimore shot a small, grateful glance toward Amara. She blinked her acknowledgement. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in this trial, it felt like the tide might be turning. She could practically hear the gears grinding in Monroe and Pierce's minds, trying to figure out who was behind this. Their eyes roved over the small gallery. They might suspect Lattimore. They might suspect Tyrone's family or some activist group, but Amara was confident they would never suspect her. In their eyes, she was just a meek, powerless black girl who had no business meddling in affairs above her station. Little did they know, she was orchestrating the entire show. Later that evening, after the judge had taken the documents to review, the courthouse buzzed with rumors. Some speculated that the evidence was fabricated. Others whispered that it was just the tip of an iceberg that might bring down half the precinct. Amara moved through these conversations like a ghost, listening but never engaging, collecting every scrap of rumor and commentary. She knew the next 24 hours were crucial. If the judge decided to admit the new evidence, Monroe and Pierce's credibility would be under serious threat. They might double down, or they might try to settle. Either way, they would be reeling, and that was when they were most likely to slip up, exposing even more of their corruption. She called in a favor with a trusted colleague at the Department of Justice, requesting an off-the-record conversation with an internal affairs contact who had been stonewalled in the past. She fed them a hint about the wave of new evidence that might soon become public. The more pressure she could create from different angles, the less room Monroe and Pierce would have to maneuver. Amara also met briefly with Lattimore after court adjourned for the day. She told him quietly that there was more evidence where that came from, but they had to let the judge's decision play out first. He agreed. Reckless disclosure could lead to mistrials or even disciplinary action against him if he couldn't properly source the documents. Returning to her humble studio, Amara felt a surge of anticipation. Everything was moving according to plan. However, a nagging doubt tugged at the back of her mind. There was always the possibility that these men, with their powerful connections, might find a way to sabotage the case. She'd seen it happen before: bribes, blackmail, or worse. But she had faith in her own careful planning. Each piece of evidence was backed up in multiple locations, sealed with her authority as an assistant U.S. attorney. If anything happened to her, the files would find their way to the press. Sitting at her desk, she opened a small locked drawer and pulled out her official ID. The golden Department of Justice seal shimmered under the lamp. She ran her thumb over her name, Amara Davis, Assistant U.S. Attorney, and allowed herself a rare smile. Soon, she thought, soon the world will know. The following morning, a new tension-filled courtroom 12B. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, announced that portions of it would be admitted pending verification of authenticity. He scheduled an evidentiary hearing for the next day, during which Monroe and Pierce would have to respond to these allegations. The defense side seemed cautiously optimistic. Tyrone, who had watched his arrest turn into a legal nightmare, finally dared to show a hint of relief. Lattimore, though still guarded, appeared more confident than ever. Across the aisle, Monroe and Pierce's expressions had grown dark. Gone were the casual smirks and easy laughter. They were in crisis management mode now. The prosecutor whispered instructions to them, presumably guiding them on how to handle the upcoming hearing. Amara watched carefully from the back. She could see Pierce tapping his foot anxiously, his fingertips drumming on the desk. Monroe was more stoic, but the set of his jaw betrayed his tension. During a mid-morning break, as Amara pretended to peruse some flyers pinned to a bulletin board, she overheard the prosecutor scolding them in urgent, hushed tones. Phrases like, "Find out who's behind this," and "cover story must be consistent," floated past her ears. She caught something about an internal source who might be leaking files. Her chest tightened. If they believed there was an internal leak, they might go to extreme lengths to plug it. That could put her entire operation in danger. She took a slow, measured breath and reminded herself that she'd taken precautions. Her infiltration had been as a civilian observer, not as someone embedded in the precinct's bureaucracy. They'd have no paper trail leading back to her. Nevertheless, she had to be ready for anything. Corrupt officers sometimes turned to illegal surveillance, intimidation, or even violence when cornered. She glanced at Monroe's broad shoulders and Pierce's shifting eyes. They were dangerous men who had wielded unchecked power for too long. The next few days would be the most perilous phase of the entire operation. Still, she returned to the courtroom, head held high. They might suspect someone within their own ranks or a whistleblower in the precinct, but they would never think the quiet black girl scribbling in her notebook was the real threat. And that was precisely why she would succeed. After court adjourned for the day, Amara decided to visit a small diner a few blocks from the courthouse to go over her notes. She chose a corner booth with a clear view of the door. A waitress brought her a coffee and a slice of pie, and she spread out her paperwork discreetly. 15 minutes later, she looked up to see Monroe standing in the doorway, scanning the room. Her heart thumped in her chest. Did he follow me? She wondered. But maybe he just came in for a bite. She kept her head low, glancing at him only through her peripheral vision. Monroe grabbed a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and seemed to stare off into space. After a few moments, he turned around on the stool, and his gaze landed on her. A slow smile curled across his lips. He stood, leaving his coffee half drunk, and walked toward her booth. Amara quickly closed her folder, sliding it into her bag. She forced herself to look calm, though her mind raced. "You again," Monroe said, stopping at her table. "You got a lot of free time, huh?" She shrugged. "I was just grabbing some coffee." He slid into the seat across from her, uninvited, arms folded. "What's your deal, anyway?" She gulped, maintaining her meek facade. "I don't have a deal, sir. I told you. I'm just interested in law." He leaned in, dropping his voice. "Cut the crap. You think I don't see you in the back of that courtroom every day, taking notes like you're some hotshot reporter or something?" Amara's palms felt clammy. She forced herself not to show it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "Let me give you a little warning," he said, eyes cold. "That lawyer might have some fancy new evidence, but it's not going to stick. And you, little girl, you better learn your place." She inhaled slowly, schooling her features. "I'm not trying to cause trouble." Monroe snorted. "Yeah, well, trouble has a way of finding people who poke their noses where they don't belong." With that, he stood, tossed a few bills onto the table to cover his coffee, and sauntered out. Amara sat in silence for a moment, her heart pounding. He was trying to intimidate her, but she refused to be shaken. If anything, he had just confirmed how desperate he was. She whispered under her breath, "Your days of bullying are numbered." The next morning, Amara arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. As she climbed the steps, she noticed a small cluster of officers near the entrance, including Pierce. They glanced her way, then pretended to be engrossed in conversation. She sensed their tension, the way they stole furtive glances. She went through security and made her way to a quiet corner of the lobby, retrieving her phone to check for updates. A text message from her DOJ contact flashed across the screen. "Be careful. They're looking for a whistleblower. Reports indicate they suspect multiple leads. They might do something reckless." Her stomach churned. She knew it was risky, but she had come too far to turn back now. She was here to observe the evidentiary hearing, the pivotal moment when Lattimore would formally present the new evidence and Monroe and Pierce would be forced to defend themselves. Once inside courtroom 12B, She slid into her usual seat. She spotted Monroe and Pierce already in the front, whispering with their attorney. The judge entered, and the bailiff called for silence. Lattimore rose with a sense of gravitas and began laying out the contents of the documents. As each piece of evidence was introduced, the tension in the room mounted. Some of it pertained directly to Tyrone's case, highlighting inconsistencies in police reports. Other parts were broader, suggesting a pattern of biased policing. Monroe and Pierce grew visibly agitated as Lattimore recounted stories of other individuals who claimed the officers had planted evidence or used excessive force. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, arguing that these allegations were irrelevant to Tyrone's specific arrest. But the judge overruled some of these objections, stating that if a pattern of misconduct was proven, it could bear on the officer's credibility. Amara watched every flicker of emotion on Monroe and Pierce's faces. Anger, defensiveness, fear. They were cornered. For the first time, they couldn't simply brush off accusations. These documents were too detailed, too corroborated by multiple sources. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced he would decide which portions of the evidence would be allowed at trial. The recess that followed was a maelstrom of emotions. Reporters rushed forward to gather quotes. Onlookers whispered excitedly, and the two officers stormed out of the courtroom like thunderclouds. As they passed by Amara, Monroe shot her a glare that brimmed with malice. She felt it like a bolt of electricity, but she held his gaze with quiet resolve. That afternoon, after the judge adjourned for the day, Amara lingered in the courthouse library to do some additional research. She wanted to ensure all her angles were covered for the final showdown, the moment she intended to reveal her true identity. When she finally left, the sky outside had turned a deep indigo. The courthouse parking garage was eerily silent, the hum of flickering fluorescent lights echoing off the concrete walls. She walked across the deserted space, her footsteps echoing. A prickle of unease crept up her spine. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. Monroe and Pierce emerged from behind a column. Her pulse surged. "Working late, sweetheart?" Monroe's voice echoed menacingly. Amara turned, heart pounding but face composed. "I was just gathering more evidence, maybe?" Pierce hissed. "Who are you really?" She swallowed. "I'm nobody. I'm just." Monroe advanced closer, fists clenched. "Don't lie to us. We know you're feeding Lattimore dirt on us." "That stops now." Amara's mind raced. She had to keep the act up a bit longer. "I don't know what you're talking about." Pierce sneered. "Cut the innocent routine. We already talked to some people. You're not on the official roster of law students. You're not with any local nonprofits. Who are you working for?" Her heart thundered. If they tried to harm her here, it could be dangerous. But she also knew something they didn't. A small pin hidden beneath her jacket was recording audio and transmitting it to a secure server. She forced a tremor into her voice. "I just want justice." Monroe lunged forward, gripping her arm. "Justice? You think you know justice? Let me tell you something. Justice is what we say it is." She winced at his grip, but stared him in the eye. Pierce loomed behind him, scanning the area to ensure no witnesses. Amara's voice quivered intentionally. "You can't hurt me. People will ask questions." Monroe smirked. "Oh, we're not going to hurt you, sweetheart. We're just going to make sure you understand that if you keep messing with us, your life's going to get real difficult." They released her, and she stumbled back, playing the role of a frightened lamb. Inside, however, she was gathering every ounce of the hateful threats in her recording device. "Now get out of here," Monroe growled, "and don't show up in that courtroom again, or you'll regret it." Without a word, she turned and dashed to the exit. She didn't dare look back, but as she rushed out of the parking garage and into the cool Chicago night, she felt a surge of grim satisfaction. They had just incriminated themselves further. That night, Amara made sure the audio from her secret recording device was backed up to multiple secure locations. She listened to the exchange again and again, documenting each threat and verifying its clarity. It was more than enough to open a criminal investigation into witness intimidation. But she still needed a perfect moment to reveal it, somewhere high profile, somewhere it would make maximum impact. The next morning, she set a meeting with her DOJ contact, calling him from a pay phone to avoid any chance of wiretaps on her personal devices. They arranged to meet at a public library, where they blended in among the library patrons. She handed over a USB containing the audio files. Her contact, a seasoned investigator named Robert Park, nodded grimly. "This is serious," Park said. You've got them on intimidation. Coupled with the other evidence, we could launch a federal case. Amara pursed her lips. I want to drop the hammer in one go. No partial charges. I want everything ready. Once we go public with my identity, I'll testify under oath about all I've witnessed, and we'll use the audio. We can't give them time to wiggle out or destroy evidence. Park considered her words and nodded. We'll need a tight timeline, but I can coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Chicago. We'll set up an internal briefing. Are you safe? She thought of Monroe's crushing grip on her arm. For now, but they're spooked. They might come after me again. He patted her on the shoulder. We'll have plainclothes agents ready to intervene if necessary. Just keep your cover until we have everything lined up. Then we move in. Amara's heart surged with equal parts relief and anticipation. The moment she had been working for, both as an undercover agent and as an advocate for justice, was near. Corrupt officers like Monroe and Pierce had thrived on fear and silence, but she was about to break that silence in a way they never saw coming. Amara returned to courtroom 12B one final time in her role as the quiet observer the next day. The judge was set to rule on the new evidence's admissibility for Tyrone's case. The tension crackled like static in the air. Journalists had begun to fill the seats, sensing a bigger story was brewing. Local activists and community members arrived in support of Tyrone. Monroe and Pierce sat stiffly, dressed in suits instead of their uniforms, as if they were trying to present themselves as upright citizens. The prosecutor paced, flipping through legal pads, preparing counterarguments. Lattimore appeared calm, though Amara could see the quiet determination in his eyes. Once proceedings began, the judge delivered his ruling. A significant portion of the new evidence would be admitted. A murmur of excitement rippled through the gallery. Tyrone's supporters exchanged hopeful looks. Monroe and Pierce went pale. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, arguing that the ruling was prejudicial, but the judge stood firm. He set a trial date for the following week, giving Lattimore time to fully integrate the admitted evidence into his argument. With the session concluded, the crowd filed out, buzzing with speculation about the upcoming trial. Monroe and Pierce lingered near the front, avoiding the reporters who hovered with microphones. Amara could practically see the fear in their eyes. They were cornered animals, dangerous and desperate. She stepped outside into the bright sunlight of the courthouse steps. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text from Robert Park. All set. We strike tomorrow. Be ready. She inhaled the crisp Chicago air, letting the warmth of the sun brace her. Tomorrow, everything would change. The stage was set for the ultimate reveal. Monroe and Pierce believed they still had a chance to wriggle free. Little did they know, the entire weight of the federal justice system was about to come crashing down on them, delivered by the very person they had dismissed as just a harmless black girl. The next day, the courthouse was thronged with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Word had spread that a major announcement was coming, something that could upend the entire case against Tyrone Bips. Police officials were also present, milling about nervously. Inside courtroom 12B, the judge took his seat, frowning at the unanticipated crowd. Lattimore arrived with Tyrone, the two looking anxious yet resolute. Monroe and Pierce walked in, their eyes darting around, clearly on high alert. Then, the moment came. A representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois stepped forward and requested permission to address the court. The judge allowed it, albeit with confusion. A hush fell over the room as the representative announced that new evidence had been submitted, evidence that not only impacted Tyrone's case, but also implicated officers Monroe and Pierce in a larger pattern of corruption and intimidation. The official then turned to the gallery. If it pleases the court, I would like to introduce Assistant U.S. Attorney Amara Davis, who has been working undercover to gather this evidence. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Monroe and Pierce exchanged frantic looks. Amara rose from the back row, all eyes upon her. Gone was the timid demeanor. She stood tall, walked down the center aisle, and approached the bench with measured steps, her chin high and her shoulders square. She reached into her bag, pulled out her official ID, and presented it to the judge. The judge's brow furrowed. He inspected the credentials. Miss Davis. She nodded, her voice ringing clear. Yes, Your Honor. I have been working undercover, posing as a court observer, to investigate allegations of police misconduct and corruption involving officers Monroe and Pierce. I have extensive evidence, including audio recordings and internal documentation, which confirmed multiple counts of perjury, intimidation of witnesses, and violation of civil rights. The courtroom exploded into a cacophony of whispers, exclamations, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Monroe and Pierce looked shell-shocked, their attorney flabbergasted. The judge called for order, banging his gavel. Amara locked eyes with Monroe, who stared at her in rage and disbelief. For a moment, she recalled how he had mocked her, called her sweetheart, told her to find a better hobby. She let that memory fuel her resolve as she prepared to lay out the case in full, ready to deliver a crushing blow of justice. With the judge's permission, Amara, now formally introduced as an assistant U.S. attorney, addressed the court. She systematically presented her findings. Audio recordings. She played excerpts of the chilling threats made by Monroe and Pierce in the parking garage, where they warned her to stay away or face consequences. Documented evidence. She showed how official police reports contained discrepancies, how body cam footage had been selectively edited or lost, and how multiple complainants across different neighborhoods recounted similar patterns of harassment and drug planting. Witness intimidation. She provided statements from individuals who claimed Monroe and Pierce threatened them to prevent testimony. This included the testimony of an internal officer who had attempted to report them but was silenced. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, and the courtroom spectators listened with bated breath. Lattimore watched with a look of awe. Tyrone, seated beside him, seemed ready to break down with relief. The prosecutor, who had been representing Monroe and Pierce, fumbled for objections but found himself overwhelmed. Every attempt to challenge the authenticity of the evidence was met with timestamps, forensic reports, and digital metadata verifying its legitimacy. Monroe and Pierce looked on, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Their faces turned ashen when Amara explained she had shared copies of every file with multiple agencies, ensuring there would be no cover-ups or sudden loss of evidence. By the time she concluded, the room was dead silent. The judge, pale and visibly shaken, cleared his throat. Given the gravity of these allegations, I am ordering the immediate detainment of officers Alan Monroe and Jeremy Pierce, pending further investigation and formal charges. The trial date for Mr. Bips will be stayed until we can determine the impact of this evidence on his case. A roar erupted from the gallery. Reporters fired off questions. Bystanders cheered. Court officers moved in to cuff Monroe and Pierce. They tried to protest, but no one was listening now. Amara stepped back, breathing deeply as the swirl of activity engulfed the courtroom. The storm she had summoned was now in full force. She had dealt a staggering blow to systemic corruption, and the reverberations would echo throughout the Chicago Police Department and beyond. In the chaotic aftermath, Amara found herself swarmed by journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. She gave a brief statement emphasizing the importance of unbiased law enforcement and the need for continued vigilance against corruption. Then, federal marshals escorted her out for her own safety as the crowd clamored for more details. Over the following days, the press had a field day. Headlines in the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times blared about the undercover U.S. attorney who exposed crooked cops. National news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was a nationwide conversation about police accountability and institutional racism. Monroe and Pierce were formally charged with multiple felonies, including conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. Their bail was set prohibitively high, and Internal Affairs discovered a web of illicit activities implicating a few other officers in the 9th Precinct. Investigations widened, leading to a series of suspensions and terminations. Tyrone Bips had his charges dismissed, with the DA's office issuing a rare public apology. He walked out of jail a free man, tears of relief streaming down his face. He would later file a civil lawsuit against the city, likely to secure a substantial settlement. For Amara, the victory was profound but bittersweet. She had succeeded in her mission, but she knew there was more work to be done. One case wouldn't fix the entire system. Still, seeing the smirks wiped off Monroe and Pierce's faces, watching them led away in cuffs, was a moment of pure vindication. In a quiet conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office, Amara debriefed with her superiors. Robert Park gave her a firm handshake and a commendation letter. "You did good," he said. "You stood up for what's right." She nodded, reflecting on the tumultuous weeks she'd spent undercover. "I hope this sends a message," she replied, "that no one is above the law." In the days that followed, New stories emerged of how Monroe and Pierce had terrorized the local black community for years without consequence. People Amara never met came forward, sharing relief that finally someone had pulled back the curtain on the intimidation and racism they endured. And so, karma had delivered its blow. The arrogant officers who once mocked a quiet black girl in court found themselves at the receiving end of a brutal but well-deserved comeuppance. Their power shattered, their reputations destroyed. They awaited trial in a cramped holding cell. Justice had arrived, and it wore the face of the very woman they had underestimated. If this story has stirred your passion for justice, or if you simply enjoy dramatic twists, let's keep the conversation alive. Corruption is a reality, but so is the power of determined individuals standing up for what's right. Amara showed us that no one is too small, too quiet, or too underestimated to make a massive impact. When systems fail, people can rise to demand accountability and shine light where darkness thrives. If you believe stories like this can inspire real change, I invite you to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring crucial stories and discussions into the public eye. Let's continue to unveil injustice and champion transparency together. Every click, every share, and every subscription is another voice added to the chorus demanding a fairer, more equitable world. Thank you for watching.